Okay, hi. Welcome to this final keynote in the Utopia and the Return of History conference. So with us today, we have the delight of being joined by Troy Vettese, who is so this information may be slightly out of date because I just Googled it. So with that proviso. Drew Vettese is or was a visiting fellow in the Department of History at the European University Institute. Troy is an environmental historian who studies the history of environmental economics, energy systems, and animal life under capitalism. He's currently revising his dissertation on neoliberal environmental thought into a book tentatively titled Beyond Externality. He collaborated with Drew Pendergrass, who we're also delightedly joined by, on numerous projects, including Half-Earth Socialism, a plan to save the future from extinction, climate change, and pandemics, which is great and currently 20% off of Verso. Drew Pendergrass is a PhD student in environmental engineering at Harvard University. He imagines how humanity can democratically govern itself in an age of environmental crisis. In his scientific research, he builds computer systems to make maps of pollutants and their sources. In his activism and organizing, he works to make ecological democracy a reality in Massachusetts. So together with social scientists, historians, and designers, Troy and Drew together imagined the institutions and protocols that would allow humanity to democratically manage our economy and its interchange with ecosystems. And I am personally wildly enthusiastic about their project to materially design a post-revolutionary, radically democratic and egalitarian socialist society where all life on Earth can flourish collectively. So now, over to you guys.
Hello. Thanks for that very kind introduction. We're very happy to be here. So we're going to do a bit of a tag team lecture where I will introduce the topic, and then Drew will jump in, and then I'll wrap things up. And what we're going to be talking about today is our new works. We want to write a sequel or to build on our previous work, which was Half-Earth Socialism. And in this case, for today's talk, we're going to assume that capitalism cannot solve the environmental crisis. Capitalism cannot be reformed to deal with economic inequality, to deal with biodiversity loss, to deal with climate change and so forth, and therefore planning is necessary. This is the big assumption here, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But what we're trying to get into is if we assume that capitalism cannot be reformed and the only alternative is still socialism, despite the many problems with socialism in the 20th century, then how can we reform socialism? How can we make socialism work so it's democratic, so the economy doesn't collapse, and how can it also deal with the environmental crisis? And we think that as socialists, we should not keep utopia or the future of socialism as a taboo subject that we don't talk about, only refer to in hushed tones. We have to engage with it seriously and treat it as a practical problem that we can solve, right? And that's what we're trying to do with our work today. So we're trying to think through the problems of planning, and we've come up with three major problems we think that have to be addressed in planning theory. We call this the Hayek problem, the Kornai problem, and the Gorgias problem. So first, I will talk a little bit about the importance of utopia, why we need utopianism. We will then get into these three problems. The Hayek problem, named after the neoliberal, paterfamilias Friedrich Hayek, and that deals with information. The Kornai problem is named after the Hungarian planner János Kornai, and this is the problem of institutions. And the Gorgias problem takes us back to ancient Greece, and this is the problem of experts. And then we'll talk about transition. So we're going to try to do a lot, and we're going to blitz through this. So why utopia? So again, I am supposed to be a historian working on environmental ideas of neoliberals, supposed to be working on intellectual history. These fun, zany manifestos for vegan communism are a bit of a side project for us, but one that we think is very important. But when I do my historical work, I was struck by reading Foucault's lectures on neoliberalism, which were carried out in the 1970s, so before the neoliberal revolution really takes off. And he's quite prescient, obviously, in this regard. But he has a line about socialism that struck me, where he says that while liberalism and neoliberalism have a governmentality, socialism does not. right? Socialism, the governmentality of socialism cannot be discerned from Marxist texts, from the Marxist canon. It has to be invented. And I think here is the problem that we have to deal with today, right? The problem is we have Marxism, which is a very rich, a very useful tradition that provides us with analytical tools to understand what capitalism is and the tendencies within capitalism, but is not very useful for understanding society after capitalism. And this is where we have to turn to the utopian tradition, or what is called utopian socialism, which is really a heterogeneous mix of thinkers who are quite different from each other, but they were similar enough in that they try to imagine society after capitalism, and they had a certain openness to that imagination, where Marxism can have a conservative tendency where it assumes socialism will just realize the potential of existing society, whereas the utopian socialists thought that socialism gave us the potential to choose how we govern ourselves and how we relate to nature. So I won't talk too much about this tradition, but we're in Manchester, so I think it's useful to talk about the work of Robert Owen and his movement. It's important to remember that one of the halls of science, which was an Owenite meeting place, one of the halls of science in Manchester is where Engels learned about socialism, and he also would write for an Owenite newspaper. A lot of ideas that are quite important to Marxism, such as the concept or the thought that capitalism is an inverted world, or from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, or this worry about the division of town and country. These are all ideas from the utopian socialist tradition. Right? We also have to remember the scale of the Owenite movement. Owen and his colleagues were involved in the cooperative movement. They were involved in the trade union movement. They were able to produce 2 million pamphlets a year and really galvanize the labor movement in the first half of the 19th century. And again, they had this openness to imagine what could society be like. They had radical ideas about free love and relations between men and women. He was a pioneer in children's education as well, and many members of Owenite communities, about half of them, some estimate, were vegetarians, right? And some of the most important lieutenants, such as William Thompson, were vegetarian. So this is, I think, a rich tradition. But this is not a plea to return to utopian socialism, but rather we need to be open about mixing our Marxism with our utopianism. We have to remember that the most successful movements today are utopian, and I'll talk about 2 of them. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement has been so successful in mobilizing people in their millions because it is a utopian project, right? We have to imagine that solving the problem of abolishing police, abolishing prisons, these are very difficult but inspiring problems, and to translate that kind of utopian goal into reality forces people to think in the long term and organize in the short term and medium term as well. It also gives people the reason to go onto the streets and risk life and limb to defend these ideas. I think Marxists can't expect people to die on the barricades if it's only a vague a presentation of what the future can look like. We need to give people something more substantial. The other great utopian movement is neoliberalism. And this is a movement that is an anti-humanist utopianism. The subject they're trying to liberate is not humanity, but the market. The market is this godlike figure that is omniscient, whereas humanity is puny and ignorant and foolish. But it is a goal where all of humanity and nature will be regulated through this omniscient market. And that coheres a group of radical intellectuals where they have not only the Mont Pelerin Society, which is quite influential, but 500 think tanks from around the world with 20,000 think tankers in it, let alone countless journalists and academics. And they're able to work together despite differences and again, translate philosophy into policy. Hayek noted the importance of utopianism early on. In an essay in 1949, Socialism and the Intellectuals, he argues that the left has been successful in that it has been utopian, right? Where there maybe he's giving too much credit to the left. But he said the liberals needed their own utopia. They needed their own positive program. They needed to be radical as well. So he has learned that lesson from the left, and the left has forgotten that lesson. I have a picture of LARPers here, and for the cool kids in the room who don't know what LARPing is, that's live action role playing, and that's where people pretend to be like a knight or whatever, you know, and they have sword fights. And there is the son of an important neoliberal you may have heard of, Milton Friedman. His son, David Friedman, is an avid LARPer where he plays a 12th century Bedouin poet. And I bring this up because Quinn Slobodian, who's a fellow historian of neoliberalism, says that neoliberals and anarcho-capitalists have LARPed into reality their utopian fantasies, right? Where they take things like cryptocurrencies, which are foolish and plausible ideas, and make them real, right, through this LARPing into reality. The question is, how do we turn our fantasies, our utopias into reality? And now, on this note, I'll hand it over to Drew.
All right. I'm just going to move this here. Do a little exchange. All right. So let's get into some of the neoliberal critique. So, as Troy said, we're going to go through three problems that have been posed by socialism. And the first two problems, which I'll be talking about, are epistemological problems. There are problems with planning that emerge from sort of a critique of knowledge, the knowledge that is involved in this. And then Troy will go into kind of a third epistemic critique. So our story for the Hayek critique starts with the German Revolution in 1918, 1919, in particular this one moment in Bavaria. This is the Bavarian Council Republic. So for a brief period, this workers' movement, this council movement, took over factories and established a radical form of something like a direct democracy where production was managed by these large councils of workers. And they hoped to abolish capitalism and markets at the same time. So this was a movement that wanted to plan things directly, not let markets deliberate what we do. And an important figure in this movement was Otto Neurath. Neurath is an interesting philosopher. He's known for this idea of pseudo-rationality. The idea of pseudo-rationality is that there are certain forms of thinking that appear to be rational, but actually aren't. And these forms of thinking are marked by having a single incommensurable unit, or a single unit that makes all things commensurable. So profit or money is an example of a pseudo-rational instrument, because you can do a cost-benefit analysis, or you can calculate your profits. You can make something that you do math. It looks like it's really smart, but then you destroy the environment or something, which is not very smart, maybe. So that's the idea of pseudo-rationality. You simplify the world into a single instrument, and then you get irrational outcomes. And he also critiqued socialist proposals like labor vouchers, which might, maybe are better than money in some sense, but have the same sort of logic of flattening everything. This gets to this idea of planning without markets. We can deal with these incommensurable units. We can deal with all the things that we want the economy to be. And Neurath has this idea of economic democracy as thinking about the economy as a whole. So he calls this scientific utopianism. So he imagines that some office will prepare images of the future that are in detail. So we might have a detailed blueprint for how much steel we'll produce, what will it be used for, and all these things. And this might be a future with a lot of public housing, or maybe there's a future with more single-family housing or something like this. And then we can debate and compare these futures, their benefits, their trade-offs, and then decide collectively which path to follow forward. So this is a proposal for a way to deal with incommensurability and also to plan directly in a way that's democratic. That was his goal, at least. Whether he achieved it with this particular proposal maybe is debatable. And his idea of incommensurability comes a little bit from his experience as a war planner. He was involved in the Austrian war ministry, and he found that when you were involved in war planning, that it's not useful to think about the total cost of all these things. Instead, you need the tanks to go this place or this to go this place. So it's this basically taken from the reality of this real struggle, and also from his study of ancient Egypt, which was what he did his dissertation on. So So Neurath has this proposal, but not really able to see it come to reality because the Bavarian Republic is crushed. But his legacy lives on in the famous critiques of his plan. So Ludwig von Mises over here writes a famous critique of Otto Neurath. This is sort of, in a way, the great ancestor of neoliberals. And what von Mises says is that, sure, you can maybe decide collectively what your final goods might be. You might decide as a group that we want this many pens and this many books, or maybe I can grant that. But what you can't do is you can't decide what to do with intermediate goods. So something like just bars of steel. Do you use those bars of steel to make a new factory? Do you use them to make a new building? How do you know what to use that intermediate stuff for that you can't really survey people or invite people in to discuss? Instead, you need price. Price is the thing that allows you to allocate these goods. It's an important piece of information that is difficult to do without. Price tells you, where is this steel most useful? So let's take a little bit of a break from this critique because I want to return to how we might respond to von Mises' critique, but I want to tell a little bit about the afterlife of Neurath after this episode of planning. And Neurath gets involved in this, this idea of isotype. So the idea with this is that despite his idea of like scientific utopianism, like these total plans to govern society, Neurath was a great critic of technocracy. He really thought that it would be horrible if, quote, people of the totalitarian kind try to make scientists the leaders of a new society like the magicians, nobles, or churchmen of the former society. So he wanted to have a way of making the economy visible to ordinary people, and this was the idea of isotype. So he got involved with a museum movement. This museum was linked to some of these direct settler movements, which were these movements to make garden cities in Vienna, so sort of a squatters movement outside of the city. And so this museum kind of emerges organically out of that struggle. And the idea is to give working class people, the ability to understand what's going on in the economy, and maybe they could be able to direct it themselves. Yes, so Isotype emerges out of a collaboration with Marie Rademeister and a few other artists. And here's an example of it. It kind of looks like pictograms, but the idea is, again, to make the economy legible to people, even if they don't speak the same language, and even if they're illiterate. So it's an exercise in making the economy visible, whereas neoliberalism, as Troy was pointing out, the market is this grand, unknowable, godlike thing that we must submit to, right? It's this almost mystical relationship that we humans are too puny to understand, whereas Isotype is an exercise in trying to make the economy perceptible. So back to von Mises. So von Mises makes this critique about intermediate goods, and then the socialists have an answer. So this is called the socialist calculation debate, for those of you in the know. And Oskar Lange and Abel Lerner have a famous response. This is an idea of market socialism. They basically argue that you could use an auctioneer to kind of determine centrally planned prices. So you have this sort of experimental filling out of what the prices might be for these intermediate goods. And this allows you to rationally allocate these intermediate goods. You can prove things that this is an equilibrium, approach. This can make an efficient economy. In theory, this should be just as good as capitalism at allocating these sort of goods rationally. And but they have to concede to Mises that we need a single incommensurate unit. We need money, even in socialism. That's their conceit. And then Hayek comes back with a deeper critique than Mises, where Hayek says that the problem is not a problem of intermediate price alone. The problem is the problem of that the central planners, like this Lange Lerner, still has a centrally planned economy. The problem is that these planners can't actually accumulate all the relevant information necessary. There's a lot of tacit knowledge out there in the world that is not articulated, held by these various firms, and that knowledge is not possible to bureaucratically or otherwise, allocate to the center. Instead, prices are the thing that do this automatically. When I see he uses the metaphor of tin. If I run a factory and the price of tin rises, I don't need to know why the price of tin has gone up in order to maybe substitute an equivalent input material. So this is often taken as like an example of why the Eastern Bloc failed, this problem of information. The central planned bodies in the Eastern Bloc were unable to get enough information. They made irrational plans, and everything fell apart. And what I'm going to do with this second problem of Kornai is complicate this a little bit and actually argue that information, in this idea of like accumulating knowledge to the center, is not so much the problem, but there's a problem of a deeper problem, a much more challenging problem to overcome. if Hayek is the real reason why socialism failed, then it might inspire you to make like a computer-planned utopia. Like maybe we just have a really powerful computer, or we have really good data coming in. And if we have the best computer, the best data, maybe we can solve this problem. But I think Kornai shows that there's a deeper problem of institutional structures. So János Kornai is a Hungarian economist. He became one of the most famous Eastern Bloc economists. And here he is meeting with some planners in Kolkata. He had lots of collaborations with planners around the world. And you have to remember, in this period, a lot of the economy, even in capitalist worlds, was partially planned. So he had lots of connections with French planners. Malenbo is the most famous. A lot of planners in Egypt he worked with. And then, of course, planners throughout the Eastern Bloc. So Kornai is basically using this idea that was developed in the 1940s by Leonid Kantorovich. This is the idea of linear programming. Those of you who have a STEM background might be familiar with this. This is a very common mathematical optimization technique. The idea is that you can optimize any function subject to constraints by inequalities. So here's a little diagram of a function that has these constraints of inequalities, and that creates this sort of colored in region. And what Kantorovich proved is that the optimum of this function, which is represented by this red line, will be at one of the 4 points that is outlined by these inequalities. You don't really need to know the details of this, but the point is that even if you only had a pen and paper, as a lot of these planners did, you could actually set up a quite complicated problem, like the problem of optimizing all the input and output of a factory. By just writing down these equations, you check the corners when you draw this little, it's called the feasible region, and then you can very quickly decide what the optimum arrangement of the factory is according to the problem you've set it up. So Kantorovich was the Soviet economist, and he was hoping to reform the Soviet economy using this math. The idea was, we have this unaccountable bureaucracy, but maybe we could centrally plan with the computer instead. This sort of this utopia of shadow prices is what Kornai ends up calling it. I'll explain that a little bit in a second. But there was a real movement of reform in the Eastern Bloc using this sort of mathematical method. In the same way that you might see a vogue for certain people online being like, AI will solve communism. So to go back to Kornai, was joined the Communist Party in his youth, fighting fascism, and he became a reporter for a party magazine. And then he kind of begins to get a little bit disillusioned with how things are working out. He goes to school to become an economist, which is the ultimate disillusionment for him. And then the tanks roll into Budapest, 1956. Kornai joins this revolt, and this basically marginalizes him for a long period of time. They put him out to pasture in intermediate textile planning. But Kornai proves himself because he gets really into this new math. This math was, after the secret speech, there's this thaw period, and this idea of linear programming as a way to reform socialism really takes off. And Kornai is able to capitalize on this because he's a really sharp guy. He's able to really improve cotton industry in Hungary by applying these methods to make production more efficient. And then he eventually convinces the Central Committee to give them a very large grant to try and program the entire Hungarian economy. So we're going to try and replace this planning apparatus with a computer. So here's an example of a computer from the period. This is not the computer he used. But this is a very fascinating paper where they actually really did build this computer model of the Hungarian economy and use it to partially plan things. So the problem, as Kornai stated it, was to optimize 4,479 activity variables subject to 2,055 constraints. This is things like how much steel should be produced, what should our export mix be, all these things like this. And the constraints are things like how many factories do we have, how many hours of labor do we have, all these things like this. And the idea is to collect this information in the center and calculate. And importantly, Kornai didn't think that there was a problem of information because he was able to make approximate plans. The idea of central planning was never, as Hayek said it, to do all of the planning in the center and then aggregate it all out. This is not to say that things weren't terrible and dictatorial, but just that the reality of the planning problem is that it was always decentralized. There was some amount of planning in the center, and then the details were worked out in planning bodies farther and farther away from the center. So the idea was to do a multi-level plan where you work out the details in the center. You send out what are called shadow prices to to other sectors of the economy, or branches or enterprises. These shadow prices are sort of like marginal prices in neoclassical economics, but they emerge out of the optimization algorithm organically. They kind of tell you what is the cost of substituting one amount of material with another. And then those prices are used to recalculate, goes to the center. There's this iterative process. And what Kornai found is that this actually worked, and it worked a lot better than the bureaucratic model of central planning. So, you are able to, depending on what you're optimizing for, you could save 7.5 billion forints in your surplus consumption, so that you could get more goods to market for people in Hungary, et cetera, et cetera. So this was improvements over the official plan by just removing waste. So Kornai was kind of trying to show this feasibility of this computer model. But all is not well, right? Why don't we hear about, this great period of the 50s and 60s where all of a sudden this Eastern Bloc socialism became suddenly more efficient, and they're able to achieve full communism by 1980, as they all dreamed. And this sort of, I'm going to share a little bit of an example from an analogous effort in the Soviet Union. There's something called the System for the Optimal Function of a Socialist Economy, or SOF. This was sort of a cybernetic utopia that was imagined by a lot of actors there. The idea is they were trying to do something even more complex than what Kornai was, which is that there was this proposal called OGAS, which would have put computers in all the firms in the Soviet Union to send live information back to the center so that we could constantly be recalculating our plans, have the most optimal plan imaginable, updated in real time. This is sometimes called the early Soviet internet, or the idea of a Soviet internet. It never came to be for a few reasons. And this is also some of the reasons why Kornai's problems fell. So there are maybe two main problems with this idea of a utopia of computer-planned economy. The first problem is an information problem, in a sense, which is that in the case of SOF, when they were training these factory managers to use the computer, they were happy to supply accurate data as long as this was just a game, as long as this was just like, we're trying to learn if we can possibly plan the economy with a computer. But as soon as it was time to make the 1976 to 1990 long-term plan, everyone started lying immediately. The idea was that you're evaluated as a firm manager by if you can meet the quotas that are allocated to you by the center. If you can control the information you give to the center, give the center information that you have maybe one less machine than you do, or maybe you have a little less input than you do, less manpower than you do, so that you can easily make your quota and you can go home early. The other problem was the problem of power. These cybernetic planners were recognized, probably rightly, by central committees, by the party, as threats to power, because power over the economy is quite, it's nothing to be laughed at. And so, there are these quotes from Politburo meetings, which is like, if you let these scientists walk all over you, they'll control the party now. And so they have to be isolated. And that's sort of what happened. These plans were basically abandoned. So why am I talking about this story? What I want to kind of get at is what is the real problem that was going on here? What was the real problem that was being failed to be addressed? Why didn't computers solve this, and why couldn't computers now solve this problem? And this is what Kornai gets into in sort of his late career when he's reflecting on his failure to solve socialism. And this is when he's starting to get disillusioned even more with the system. Kornai argues that the economy is divided into two parts, any economy, socialist, capitalist, otherwise. There's a control sphere and there's a real sphere. The control sphere is where ideas of what to produce, what to invest in are produced. It's the sphere of the plan in the socialist economy. In the real sphere, that's where the work gets done. That's the factories, that's the people who are doing things in the real economy. Under capitalism, Kornai argues, the control sphere and the real sphere are both controlled by money. So money is a price system. Price tells us what to produce in some sense. It tells us trade-offs. This is sort of the neoliberal argument that money is information, price is information. But they miss something really important about price, which is that it's also coercive. Under capitalism, money is also an instrument of the real sphere because it calculates something, and then if you ignore it, you become homeless or you become bankrupt, right? I live in the US, so if I'm not listening to money, then, I might not have health care, right? So money is coercive. Money forces you to do things. Marx calls this mute compulsion, right? No one has a gun to your head, but if you behave in a certain way, you won't have any money, and that's no good. And this, importantly, also applies to capitalists. It applies to rich people. It applies to factory owners. If they don't follow the rules, if they don't follow what money tells them to do, then they might go bankrupt. So money is an instrument of the control sphere and the real sphere. Under socialism, classical socialism as he calls it, there's no such organic connection. There's a plan and there's reality, and there's nothing that organically makes the plan influence the real world. Sometimes he calls this the short budget constraint. This is the famous way that he says it, which is that if you're running these state-owned factories, it doesn't really matter if your budget balances because the money is sort of made up. And all that really matters is that you have a good relationship with the planners, right? So if you have a good relationship with the planners, you can do whatever you want. And you might be running a very efficient factory, but you might offend someone, and then you might be in trouble. So the connection between the real sphere and the control sphere is enforced by direct coercion, not mute compulsion, regular compulsion, by guns. This is Kornai's argument. So here's the psychotic diagram that's capturing a little bit of what Kornai is saying. Kornai sets up a binary. His binary is that there are two ways to handle the real sphere and the control sphere in a complex modern economy. He concedes that maybe a small-scale economy might have other forms of coordination that could get out of this. But his main point is that a complex modern economy with things like factories has two means of solving this. You have capitalism over here on the left, where you have money being both control and real instrument. Money interacts with the real world through mute compulsion, and then the information of money feeds back to the control sphere through price, and people update their plans accordingly. And then I'm calling it Stalinism, but Kornai calls it classical socialism. The idea is that you have violence makes the control plan real, and then you get surveys and you update your plan accordingly. And his argument, his kind of real innovation in his late work, is saying that no matter where you start, you're going to end up with one of these two arrangements. You might have a movement that is really liberatory and inspiring at the beginning, but as this control sphere and real sphere are separated, maybe at the beginning, you might have to start changing your institutions. You might have to start centralizing power. You might have to start coercing factories if they're not behaving. Or you could go the other way. You could do the market reforms of the 1980s. The firms are not obeying our prices. Let's make the soft budget constraint a hard budget constraint. Let's allow bankruptcies. So he's basically saying you need to either send in soldiers or you need to send in mute compulsion. That's the only way to solve this problem. This is a very disturbing argument because it suggests that maybe Troy and I have been wasting our time and that maybe there's no way out. But you might have been thinking about some problems with both Hayek and Kornai and really everyone we've been talking about so far. They're very technocratic, top-down. There's not really any thinking about what do normal people want. It's more like how do we make normal people behave according to what we've decided is best for them. And this is not just our thought. This is a major way of thinking in the post-colonial world. Troy will talk a little bit more about this. So this is a very fascinating figure over here on the left. His name is Joseph Edwards. He was a refrigerator worker in Jamaica. He also led a bunch of wildcat strikes in this post-colonial moment. Actually, there were quite a lot of wildcat strikes, so these sort of illegal strikes throughout the Caribbean in the post-colonial moment, a moment where firms are being nationalized, right? The colonists are, gone at least in name. We're taking over these firms. We're trying to, build a social democracy in some sense. I was very intrigued by coming to Manchester, and there's an Arthur Lewis building. Arthur Lewis was one of these famous economists and planners to some degree in the Caribbean. He's on the Eastern Caribbean $100 bill. He also has a building here. And actually, I looked at Judy's emails, and Judy's office is in Arthur Lewis building. But Arthur Lewis has a quote where he says that the plan is an exercise of imagination and its implementation is a struggle with reality, which I think is exactly the sort of thing that Kornai and other technocratic planners were expressing. What Joseph Edwards says is that the plan is completely irrational unless it is formed by workers, for workers, in a sort of council movement, in a sort of direct democracy movement. Joseph Edwards belongs to a sort of informal collective of Caribbean activist direct democracy thinkers who are sort of active in the early 1970s. But Troy will take us back to sort of the prehistory with C.L.R. James in a moment. But what I really like about Edwards is he also talks about the problem of representation. Because some of these nationalized firms, they allowed seats on the boards for workers, but he noticed that as soon as the workers go on the boards, they become worker bureaucrats, is what he calls them. So he really thinks that you can't solve this problem with just representation. You can't solve it with vote. You need to solve it with some form of direct democracy. Otherwise, you're going to have this problem of coercion. And yeah.
Great. So I'm back, and we're going to talk about the next problem, which is the Gorgias problem. So as Drew was saying, direct democracy may present a solution, or at least a third way out of Kornai's dilemma, right? So Kornai basically said the choices between Stalinism and capitalism, he will reluctantly choose capitalism. So he's this reluctant Hayekian, right? And then Drew and I are trying to argue that the third way out of this is actually to make plans more democratically agreed upon, and have more participation of ordinary people, and have people moving in and out of government, right? And this will, first of all, increase or solve to some extent motivational problems that you find in socialism, and also allow the circulation of information as well. Instead of having workers and planners being separate, if every worker will become a planner at some point, you also have that circulation. And we will focus more on this problem of coercion and legitimate coercion, but we think this direct democracy proposal is promising, or at least may present one solution out of Kornai's dilemma. So I'll talk a little bit about C.L.R. James, and he's really the inspiration for this. In 1956, he wrote a pamphlet called Every Cook Can Govern, and this is just a few months before the tanks roll into Budapest. And he says, if we look to ancient Athens, we can see that the Athenians had faith in the average citizen to be able to run government, and it's bizarre that advanced industrialized societies in the 20th century in Britain and the US do not give that same faith to the average citizen. And then he explains to the reader these Athenian institutions where people were chosen by sortition, so they were chosen randomly, to participate in the council, which was a 500-member body, and they would be involved in the day-to-day running of government and also crafting legislation. And that legislation would be voted on by 5,000 citizens who would be basically collected quite randomly. There actually was a problem of having enough participants for a quorum, so the Athenian proto-police force, which were the Scythian archers, would go into the agora and just grab people and throw them into the assembly. So people in the assembly would vote on the proposals made by the council. So James is presenting this as like, this is how socialist governance should work, because he's worried about the threat of authoritarianism. He's an ex-Trotskyist. He's worried about Stalinism. He thinks socialism has a potential to degenerate into this parasitic, technocratic elite that dominates the working class. But having workers participate in government is a way out of this. And it's funny, too, that a collaborator of his and another ex-Trotskyist, Cornelius Castronatus, said that he had never heard of any socialist talking about ancient Athens, and he himself was a Greek socialist, until he met James, right? And but we'll talk then a bit about this Gorgias problem. So we can say what we're proposing is different from most proposals in the very limited debate on the left on what planning can look like. And I think generally you have like a very small scale, like Ostromium Commons or some kind of anarchist, small, communities. Then you have this like very large scale AI and super algorithms are going to solve everything. And we are kind of going between these things, right? So this is we have this Marxist and also a Hayekian critique of neoclassical economics, that we need to care about politics, we need to care about information and have a certain epistemology that's not naive. And and to solve that, we're pushing to this radical democratic dimension that, again, is not small scale, right? Like this direct democracy has to be scaled up to the planet. So let's talk just a second more about Gorgias. So Gorgias, for those who don't know, is a rhetorician. So he taught rhetoric in Sicily, and he debated Socrates. And that debate was whether lay people could tell the difference between real experts and fake experts, or rather students of Gorgias who were trained in rhetoric to speak very well, and they actually could speak more convincingly than an expert. So a lay person can't tell the difference between an expert and a non-expert. Only experts can tell that difference. So is democracy possible if lay people can be convinced by charlatans, right? So this is the problem that Socrates and Plato and Gorgias are interested in. We draw a bit on Josiah Ober, who's a classicist, and he combines some of the different work of Aristotle and the Poetics and Politics, and to make this democratic epistemology, where basically if you have enough ordinary people, they will know less individually than the expert, but combined they will know more. And this is different from the neoliberal argument of this marketplace of ideas, as in people acting through the marketplace will accumulate information. So prices only include so much information and don't deal with externalities very well. But the hope is democratic deliberation will allow people to accumulate knowledge greater than experts, or at least be able to judge expert advice well, because you still will need experts in a social society, right? In Athens, they had to invite shipwrights to give advice on shipbuilding for their navy during the Peloponnesian War, for instance. So we will need experts in the future for plans for healthcare or fighting climate change and so forth. So, but, and this is not to say that ordinary people will not make mistakes. I mean, clearly juries can convict innocent people, right? But studies show that juries tend to make fewer mistakes than judges, actually. So, I mean, this is where socialism doesn't have to be a perfect society, but it has to be a society that allows everyone to be free, to escape markets, and to function well enough. And we will also talk about some other trade-offs. I just had this picture of the assembly to show where these sophists versus experts would actually be debating. We also draw a lot on the work of, I'll say one more thing actually about this assembly. So this argument that we are getting from Ober is actually already present in James in that essay where he says ordinary people were voting and choosing who would win the theater festival in Athens, this festival of Dionysus. And they chose the best works in Greek literature, and a jury of experts could not have chosen better. So we already are seeing that in James. We draw quite a lot on the work of Ellen Meiksins-Wood, who is known for her work on political Marxism, but also worked quite a bit on classics. In 1988, she wrote a book called Peasant, Citizen, and Slave. And there we can draw some other lessons from the Athenian example. She's less overt than James in saying that Athens is a model, but I think it is there implicitly. And that basically is she says that democracy takes time. So like James, she says that without this parasitic elite class, if people are governing themselves, Athenians were unusual where they did not have to produce a surplus for that elite, and therefore they had time for democracy. That time also came from ecological rhythms. This was an agricultural society, so when they're waiting for their crops to grow and whatnot, they could have time for deliberation. And this is something that Drew and I would emphasize, that self-government and direct democracy takes time. So everyone should expect to eventually serve in government, and that will eat up a lot of time. Right? And this is, I think, something that socialists now don't really want to admit. Slavoj Žižek recently had a talk a few years ago where he made a plea for bureaucratic socialism, where he's like, I just want socialism to work, and I just want someone else to figure things out. I don't want to go to meetings all the time. And I think we have to push against that in some ways. As in, like, information, if it's not going to be circulating through markets, if we're not going to rely on coercion, we have to make time for democracy. And this leads to what Drew likes to argue are non-ecological reasons for degrowth, right? So if we have to have some coercion, right, some legitimate coercion, we want to minimize it. We also want to, we have to realize that there's going to be work that is unpleasant. So both Wood and James argue that slavery was not especially important or foundational to the Athenian economy, and we can debate that, and we can go into that in the Q&A. But that is similar in some ways to the argument of full automation in socialism. So if we don't have slavery or machines to do the work for us, we will have to share unpleasant work. Right? So the goal has to be, we have to either share it through sortition, and also minimizing the industries that require unpleasant labor, say like fast fashion or cheap meat and all this. And these are the ways we have to deal with this, again, Kornaian problem of what is a good or minimal acceptable coercion. I have this picture from the German Institution of the Civic civic duty, the Zivildienst, where instead of a conscription, young men could opt to do social work for a year. And I think we have to think about these alternative ways of sharing work. But the social society will have to be slow in some ways. Here's just a really cool little picture of almost like a proto-machine that Athenians used for a sortition. Because what they were interested in was to make sure that you had a representative for juries or for the council from all the different neighborhoods. There's 10 neighborhoods in, try to wrap up. 10 neighborhoods in Athens, these demis, and these, interestingly, are very artificial neighborhoods, right? They cut across, coastal, inland, or urban areas. They also cut across families and ethnicities, and that was to break up Athens in this artificial way to prevent any kind of other allegiance. But they also want to pick people equally from these 10 neighborhoods, and they did that by people would put in their card in each row, and then if you drew a white ball, you would discard that row, and if you drew a yellow ball, you would choose like those people in that row. And a very similar method is used now for climate assemblies. So you want to choose people by region, by ethnicity, by class, by gender, and so on. So they use a very similar method as the Athenians. I think we can also see, we also can imagine how do we transcribe or transpose these ideas from ancient Athens to the present, right? How do we build our own Tower of Babel in a way? How do we rule ourselves as a planetary species? And I think the climate assemblies that have been going on today are quite interesting, and they also prove that the Gorgias problem is not as serious as Gorgias supposed, that Ober and James are correct. These climate assemblies, ordinary people can understand the climate crisis, and they can make very radical proposals. They often call for the restriction of flying or meat consumption. And there's even attempts to make global climate assemblies where you have simultaneous translation. And one can imagine scaling up these assemblies. So basically what Drew and I are interested in, or potentially, would be having such assemblies at a global scale that would make rough plans in terms of energy consumption or land use or carbon emissions and so forth. And then different regions would then have their own assemblies chosen through direct democracy that would implement these plans. So this is, again, I was trying to say, like a mix of these small scale, or like technocratic socialist proposals. I think we need to mix these things together, right? So transition. So I also want to make clear that what Drew and I are working on here is that we're not trying to say that we have all the answers, right? We're not trying to say we know what a socialist utopia looks like. What we're trying to provoke is that we want other socialists, other environmentalists, and other progressive movements to think seriously about the problem of government, to think seriously about getting beyond our current society, because clearly it's not working for everyone. We should have a discussion of many different utopias, right? And many different practical plans for such utopias. Again, what Neurath calls scientific utopianism. So instead of having this taboo, this omerta around a socialist society, we should treat it as a practical problem that can be solved. So as I say on the bottom here, you can think of this transition maybe as play, act, govern, right? How do we LARP into reality, our utopia, right? How do we learn from the neoliberals the lessons they learned from us? Drew and I have fairly modest goals at present. We make some games, right? So this is our own LARPing. At the bottom we have this computer game based on our book called Half of Socialism, and then you play as a planetary planner. And we have a climate model in there. We try to make it as accurate as possible. We worked with a team of artists and designers. And we don't put any restrictions on people. People can play as Malthusians. They can play as technophiles. They can play as degrowthers. We leave it up to them. And the point is to really think about how do we transition from creating what is a game to creating tools that people will need in this future society where you might be chosen to represent the planetary assembly, and you need something that helps you think through the plan that you will help make, right? And it would be something potentially like this, some kind of simulation. And that is the goal. And we're actually, we sold maybe 9,000 books, something like that. And then the game has been played by 90,000 people, right? And people have been very excited. We've been translating it to many languages, including Esperanto, which we find a little funny. And then a lot of people are quite interested. We get this from players. They want to make like a wiki version of the game. They want to open up the game so they can see inside the game. Like, what are our assumptions? Can they add cards? And so forth. So this is something that we're working on now. Above, there's a game called Daybreak. This is a board game. A friend of ours, Matteo Menapace, worked with Matt Leacock, who designed Pandemic. If you play games, you would have heard of that. It's sold millions of copies. And their game, they're trying to make a climate game. You have to reduce emissions, draw down carbon, and so forth. And he wants to work with us, and we're interested in making a game where you have to think through the problem of what is that transition to socialism, right? How do radicals mobilize, create, achieve hegemony when they're facing the rising threat to fascism, economic stagnation, and climate disaster? Like, what are the next 20 years going to look like? And try to get this out to a large audience, right? So to think through these problems. It would be nice, like my dream would be like a new Neuratian exhibition that I have on the right here. I think we need to have it'd be nice to have a gallery where we can work with the curators to show plans, even plans perhaps made by climate assemblies, and show futures so people, again, can see the economy, see these choices, and have debates over them as well. So ACT, the second part. In some ways, it's been nice to talk to many activists and readers and players of our projects. I had met with this minister in Spain who resigned recently, Alberto Garzon, and a couple of years ago, he had this anti-meat campaign. He wanted to encourage Spaniards to eat less meat. And when I met him, he said, I saw this as an eco-socialist campaign. We want to make a coalition that brings together socialists, animal liberationists, and environmentalists, and get them to cooperate. And he said it was hard. I mean, his own government was against him. Sanchez was very critical of it. He could say it did not succeed, but we shouldn't expect the first campaigns to succeed. But it was important for building up interest within what had been the old Stalinist, Communist Party that would be interested in the environment and animal rights, and so forth. It was very exciting to be in Madrid and have at the table the activists who led the Fridays for the Future campaign that brought tens of thousands of people into the street, and to have socialist intellectuals who translate works into Spanish, and to have a government minister all sitting together. Maybe this is something we can think about. Garzon and I want to actually work on a pamphlet where we translate some of these eco-socialist ideas of rewilding and veganism and renewable energy to the Spanish case to make a more concrete proposal for the future. Wrong way. Okay. Over here, you have Ovin Hada, who's an atmospheric physicist. And what she did was she was involved in making and using a weather model to predict which areas of Tampa would be affected by a hurricane and which areas needed to be evacuated. And she worked with activists who used her scientific work to convince this jail you have over here, the Hillsborough County Jail, that they had to evacuate that jail because it was going to be hit by that hurricane. So this is an interesting case where you have activists, scientists making tools that are useful to change the world, right? And I think we need to think more about what, and eventually, in terms of governing, what do we need? We need to be in a situation of dual power in some ways, as in we can't just have climate assemblies complement the work of parliaments, but we need to see as these assemblies as replacing parliaments, as new institutions, again, at local, regional, and international levels. We also need to work closely to determine what we have as video games, or maybe Drew's work in terms of atmospheric and other kind of climate science, and to turn them into Kornai-like tools of imagining the economy and the environmental interactions at these scales to provide people with the tools to imagine these new futures. And I think what we're trying to say in today's talk is that once you break this taboo over utopianism and treat it as a problem that is soluble, that is practical, that is feasible, it becomes less intimidating. It becomes, I mean, first of all, we can imagine these are all very difficult things to achieve, but they're not impossible to achieve. A lot of socialists like to say that neoliberalism prevents us from having a future or imagining alternatives. And I would stress that we've done this to ourselves, and we must learn from our enemies and learn from inspiring social movements like Black Lives Matter to imagine and do this utopian work that is both practical and feasible, but also necessary. Thank you. Your voice is giving out.
Okay, thank you both. Who has a question?
Right, thanks very much. That was terrific. Can I just raise two questions? And it's almost like I could do it to each part of the talk. Mm-hmm. Right. The first one on sortition, and I just want to. I know what my view is on this, but I just want to get what your view is. When you talk about coercion, there's a worry if you have sortition without coercion that you get the self-selected juror. Right, and the last thing I want to be tried by is a jury that selected itself. Right, yeah. Right, and you're more likely to get guilty of that. So it looks like you're going to need coercion at that level for people that don't, for your bureaucratic socialist who doesn't want anything to do with it. So I'm just, or you have this worry about the self-selecting juror. So I just want to get your response to that. That was a question to you. And the other one is just in the history that you presented, which I thought was terrific, and actually that helps me understand the Kornai. He got me reading Kornai, right? I actually read Anti-Equilibrium after talking to Drew. Right, is the model you had still went on to a kind of shadow price socialism before that. I just wonder how much you're committed to that shadow price socialism against the kind of Noratian model, which was in kind, which rejected the idea that you could come up with optimal models. Right, so how much you were still in the Noratian critique of Langer and the half-earth, I mean, the shadow price socialism, or how much you were going along with Kantorovich and the move in that direction. So they were the two questions.
Should I ask or?
Yeah, so answer.
Yeah.
Well, we need the microphone? Or?
We can use this thing.
Okay.
We can trade off. Yeah, thanks for that question. So, you know, in our first book, we are, I think, pretty enthusiastic about Kantorovich. I would say that we were very steeped in the neoliberal critique of socialism, and when we were reading about these real experiments that were trying to overcome this information problem, we were very excited. We were like, you know, I think like many socialists, we had taken the Hayek critique to be the critique of socialism, and maybe if there's someone who's thought about it, this is really exciting. And I think, and we said in our book, like we said a lot, like, oh, it needs to be democratic. Like, I mean, this is a value for us. Like, we really like democracy and we don't want authoritarianism. But we didn't really think in detail about how that would be other than simply asserting, you know. So this is, I would say that this work is trying to think in detail, you know, using people like C.L.R. James to think about how that democracy could work. So I would say my take on algorithms in general is that they can be useful tools, like linear programming, you know, climate models. Everything can be very useful and, in fact, probably indispensable in a complex world to kind of quickly kind of understand what's going on and cut down this uncertainty, but it needs to be, you know, that in service of people. I think Ovian Mata was her work. I've met her a few times. She's at MIT, so we meet up sometimes. And her work is inspiring because the activists asked her to do this. She had been embedded with this prison abolitionist movement. She is a prison abolitionist herself. She's also an atmospheric scientist. And there was this hurricane emergency, and they had this strategy, which was we need to convince this horrible warden to actually evacuate this prison. This is a life-saving mission. And Ovian Mata was able to talk about and understand, like, how does this governmentality work, and able to make this model that was able to, you know, liberate this prison, at least, you know, save the lives of these prisoners. I think that's a great model of how these tools could be used, right? Like, it's an algorithm, there's sort of an expert there, but she's embedded in a movement. I think this is sort of the model. I mean, this, as a scientist myself, this is my model of how science should be done. And maybe that's how I think about things like linear programming now.
could add a little bit. So in ancient Greece, the word idiot meant people who did not want to participate in politics, right? And so I think what Zizek was proposing is like idiotic communism, basically, right? And I think what the Athenians found is that once they transitioned in the 4th century to actually giving people like a per diem to be on council and all this, then people were doing it, right? So I think people want to see themselves in the world. They want to be involved. I'm not too worried about recruiting enough people if we make it possible for them, I suppose. In terms of the linear programming question, I think for us, we see like the shadow pricing aspect of Kantorovich to us is less important than the materiality of, and I think we need to, of the actual things and seeing like how many things are moving different places. And because the point is not to then create this artificial market, but rather have that more material flow analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting and useful presentation. And it seems that you were assuming that the inefficiencies and poor planning were the main reason for the collapse of the socialism. Maybe not explicitly, but many things, many other things can also contributed and could have contributed. And then, one of them is probably that Eastern European socialism wanted to emulate consumption from the Western world. For instance, their decision to mass produce cars might have been another reason, and which also relates to the Utopia. And what ways are you exploring of making sure that we don't decide on like overproduction. We don't try to emulate like former lifestyles that we know from capitalism. Or if it is not a global project, what ways do we have to make sure we don't emulate the other part of the world that is capitalist and over-consuming and overproducing? And relatedly, like what ways to, not exceed ecological limits and not to violate other species and ecosystems. What are you exploring in your project?
Yeah, I can start with that. Well, the utopian answer is that if we really do have direct democracy with representing everyone on Earth, utopian hat for a moment, hopefully there would be no problem with overconsumption, because overconsumption happens because you're exploiting people, right? You're able to, work certain people in certain parts of the world in order to produce things for people in other parts of the world. This is a very common critique. And the hope would be, if everyone's represented, then you can't vote to exploit someone else. That's sort of the beautiful simplicity of the utopian dream. I suppose the other argument that Troy and I made before is that we think that this is maybe based on talking to friends and family members who are not really socialists, but when you talk about things like the environmental crisis in real terms, like in terms of like the difficulty of renewable energy, the difficulty of decarbonizing some of these things, the amount of work that needs to be done, the dangers of geoengineering, solar geoengineering is really on the horizon. Troy and I both believe. I believe because I know a lot of geoengineers and I know how scary they are. When you talk to people about geoengineering, this prospect of planes flying into the stratosphere and spraying sulfur to blot out the sun, they get a lot more interested in things like decarbonization. There's something about it that's immediate. So I suppose we have maybe an article of faith that people do care. It's just the system, doesn't really. I guess we're optimists in a sense. I guess on the question of partial stuff, maybe I'll let you hop in here, Troy.
Yeah, I would say, my own work as a historian focuses on externality, right? And the history of externality in economics. And the way neoclassicists think about it is that if you put a tax on it, like say cigarettes are bad for society, so we tax it, then neoliberal would say the market should decide the value of the externality. So we'll make a cap and trade market and people can trade for the right to cause harm. And then the other way to control externality is to control it within the plan, right? As in we have to, and this is the Neuratian angle, that we have to consider all these trade-offs for how we act in the world. And I think the promise of socialism in this very Neuratian fashion, when people can really visualize the economy and see those trade-offs, a lot of, not everyone's going to be like a carless, vegan Marxist right away. But when I think they really understand, what are they doing in the world, or what are the costs of these things? Again, the fact that so many people in these climate assemblies support restrictions of meat, which you never see discussed anywhere else, shows, I think, that openness to these more radical proposals. I think what's also interesting, and it's kind of going back to John's question, is that in ancient Greece, as Ellen Meiksens Wood points out, it was a very literate society, right? Which was unusual because, the ancient world was very poor. But people knew they would, citizens knew they would participate in government, so they wanted to be ready, so they became literate. And I think, if people knew they might eventually serve on an assembly at a local or national, level, they would also be more interested in climate science and things like this. And that's the hope in a way. And I think there's some reason for this. Will people vote for and have rewilding or things that we like? Maybe not. But I don't think a lot of people want to have that brutal relationship with nature. And this is also drawing back to that distinction at the beginning between Marxism and utopian socialism, where E.P. Thompson talks about William Morris, and the problem with Marxism was they didn't have a utopia, really. And because they didn't have a utopia, they only could argue, we'll give you material plenty. But when they couldn't give that, then things just started to fall apart. But when socialism is really about promising people just a different way of relating to each other and to nature, rather than just everyone having a Ferrari or something like that, then I think you won't run into the same problems necessarily.
Yeah, thank you for that. Could you say more about the gaming that you got 90,000 people to participate, in terms of how you did the outreach and how you consider expanding that and how that links to your book?
Mm-hmm. Well, we did it on a tiny budget. So I talked to a professor in the Netherlands, and he's like, yeah, we made our little game with 70,000 euros and we wanted to get 700,000 euros. And I was like, oh my God, if only we had that kind of money, So it was a very small project. And we basically put it on our own website, and then we put it on something called Steam, which is a gaming website. And people just found it through there, and people were discussing it on Reddit and things like that. So we didn't do a big advertising campaign or anything. But a lot of teachers and professors teach the game in class, and we hear from students and all that. And we hear a lot from players. But the goal is to, again, scale this up. And the game, again, is trying to give people the tools in a way to imagine or to see the connections between different problems of biodiversity, climate change, but also living standards and relations in the global north and global south as well. And if they choose certain things, it will cause unrest in certain areas, or will cause carbon emissions to go up. And they can try to have these more total plans or see the totality of these relationships. That's the goal of the game. But again, we're just two dudes, and we have some friends, but we want to hopefully scale some things up, and we're looking for collaborators. That's why it was very exciting to hear from Matteo, who again, he can sell 100,000 games, right? So maybe we can open things up a bit.
I might just add a couple little things to that. One thing I think that really helped is it go viral on Steam was it sparked controversy. Many gamers are right-wing, and the people were really getting into it in the Steam forums, and it sparked some really amazing conversations, really remarkable opening imaginations in this sort of unusual place. I'll also add that, we've thought about many ways of doing the game. We wanted to simulate democracy a lot more directly by having it be a massive multiplayer game where people represent different regions of the world and they have to argue with each other about what the plan should be, which would have been very fun, but it turned out to be very difficult to program. But yeah, I guess more questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question with regard to direct democracy. So when we have a society that have large number of people, and then when we also have a society that have a large number of agendas, so now this multidimensional question has to be solved, for example, in the terms of directory democracy with juries. And then now you will have almost infinite number of juries with infinite number of agendas. And then with any fraction of cost, in terms of timing, in terms of economy, this will not work. So how do you prove that this will work with direct democracy with any tiny bit of cost because of multidimensionality?
Yeah, I like the way you articulate that question as this multidimensional, cursive dimensionality problem. I suppose that the one way to start answering this is that, you know, it's not like everyone would do everything. I think the idea would be certain committees would form to deal with certain issues. And because this also helps solve the problem of experts, right? If people have time to kind of learn about an issue and deal with it that way. We also think about this as part of the working day. That's the CLR James idea. So the hope is that, you know, this is part of the working day, you have part of these things. And the other hope is that you can cut through some of this noise, right? Like some of this, you know, complexity of the world by using tools like algorithms. I mean, linear programming, as Kantorovich talked about it, is a tool to reduce the solution space, right? Like it's, you know, you looked at these points and you just looked at those points for the optimum. This is a mathematical method. It can be automated. But the hope is that, you know, things like these computer tools are indispensable because they're able to, in some ways, cut through these noise. And you can also, you know, use this idea from Kornai of planning aggregately at large scale, so not doing all the details, but rather some sort of aggregate metric, and then you work out the details closer to the problem itself. I suppose this is the combination of things that we are dealing with. And I think we might add that Athens was not a small society either. It was 250,000 people. So you don't need to rely on there being direct familial relations or friendly relations between people. It is an open question whether we could do this at scale, I guess. But maybe there's a little bit of optimism in that way. But
when you talk about cost, are you thinking in a Coasian way about it, or? Yes. Yeah. So I mean, Coase, of course, used to be a socialist, right? And his idea of transaction cost comes from Dobb and Lenin, and the idea that you know, the goal is to turn the whole economy into a single factory and to manage it that way. And it was particularly interesting is, again, as a historian of neoliberals, I went through Coase's archive, and in the 1980s, there were a lot of Chinese students and experts interested in meeting him, and they were interested in meeting him as a socialist theorist. And then later, as China became much more of a market society, they also liked him as a neoliberal theorist as well. So, and I think, Coase is definitely a super interesting neoliberal, much more creative than many, say, Chicago School economists. And he's more of an LSE neoliberal. And I think our point here is not that socialism doesn't have to produce this like perfect utopian society of like, incredible abundance and everyone can do whatever they want. But rather it has to be a society that is just merely better than capitalism and can prevent the environmental crisis and prevent authoritarianism. Those are the goals. They will definitely be problems with plans. There will definitely be inefficiencies. There may be economic stagnation and all that. But these are, like, what are the problems with with socialism versus like the benefits? Right? And I think most Marxists talk about socialism as something that has to be perfect, or otherwise it's not worth doing. What we're also interested in for the next book is actually having a chapter on Chinese planning experiences as well, because China does, has like the best and worst environmental record in many ways, where they have many large-scale, plans for renewables and rewilding, while also having obviously terrible air pollution and things like this. And there was one really interesting study by Hellman and Melton about 10 years ago, and it looks at China's plan to deal with energy intensity of GDP in the early 2000s, because the Chinese economy was booming, but then also was becoming more inefficient in terms of energy use, and they wanted to reduce it by whatever the number was, like 30% in the next 5 or 10 years. And the study is interesting, where it shows you how did they achieve that goal in terms of negotiations between different regional and national governments, but also the largest corporations in China talking to these different ministries and that kind of negotiation. So I think we want to imagine seeing China as an experimental area that does market socialism, guild socialism, a kind of iterative planning, and also Neuratian in natura planning as well, and to see what works and also how can that be democratized. Because obviously we don't want to reproduce authoritarian structures as well. So I think we have this theoretical approach, but we also can learn from practical experiences in socialist planning, which is why we're drawing on the works of Kantorovich and Kornai as well. And again, I think a lot of Marxists, they just say, oh, socialism as it has existed in the 20th century or in China is just not useful, right? It's not socialism. And I think we need to have an engaged but critical relationship with these experiences.
Thanks for this inspiring talk. I have two questions. First, regarding the notion of economic democracy. It feels to me that it's something that's very difficult when money itself is something which is monopolized by, currently private banks that are producing most of the money that we're using, and in an expansionist monetary system. So I'm wondering whether you're considering using multiple forms of currencies, including things like mutual credit systems, which basically any person could emit themselves or participate in, as also being a promising entry into economic democracy. And secondly, have you also considered political systems such as the ones that are being used in places like Rojava or in the Chiapas by the Zapatistas as interesting also experiments or examples for more direct democratic systems?
Yeah, I can start and maybe Troy can drop in. On the question of other currencies, I mean, as we've imagined it, we kind of are partial to Otto Neurath's idea of in natura planning or planning in natural units. His critique of pseudo-rationality we're quite partial to. So the idea would be, in this utopian framework would be to plan directly without the aid of money or universal equivalence. This is the proposal. As far as whether money experiments might have a role in a transition or in sort of experimentation feeling out, I'll never say no to someone who's trying to do something exciting and democratic with the economy. But I suppose I'm a little skeptical of some of those movements. We had a wonderful talk by one of the speakers here about some of these movements. On the question, remind me of the second question, real quick. Rojava, yes. So we have engaged a little bit with the democratic confederalism ideas and some of these political ideas of the Zapatistas. We've also engaged a little bit with some experiments in attempting to democratize planning in Kerala in India in the 90s. These are things that are certainly worth looking more into. We also need to look more into these examples of these wildcat strikes in the Caribbean. There's a lot of really interesting examples. There's many, many experiments to draw on in things like direct democracy, much more than I think is popularly recognized. So yes, thank you for that.
I don't have anything. Any other questions?
Yeah, when I was doing research for my own talk yesterday, I came across, I'd sort of heard of your work, and I'm so amazed to find you here, because I came across a review of Half-Earth Socialism in Socialist Standard, which is the monthly journal of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Now, they're quite enthusiastic about it, but, you started off with talking about the powerfulness of utopian projection. And I hated to break it to you, but the SPGB has been doing this for 110 years, I think, since 1903. And they have 800 members at the last count. And, I love these guys in a way. You sort of good luck to them, because they really do think it through, and they do try and present, as their pamphlet has it, socialism as a practical alternative. But it never gets anywhere. You know, and meanwhile, the real world in that 120 odd years has been transformed over and over again by what they would call the reformists and the vanguardists and so on. And they've created in the process the raw material for the real life examples that you correctly want to draw critical lessons from. I agree entirely that, you know, simply writing off existing and formerly existing socialism is not the real thing, and that there's no lessons for us, is a very bad mistake. But I really don't. I would like to see evidence that putting forward a plan for utopia actually has any traction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think part of what Troy and I think that we're doing is working through these things for ourselves. I mean, I think part of what we're trying to do is work through these issues to satisfy ourselves that maybe another world is possible and we're not totally barking up the wrong tree. And we find it to be very fun. We're not paid to do this. And it turns out to be not a lot of money in making socialist books. But so there's sort of that self-satisfactory element. In terms of like making things real, I don't have any illusions that books really do that much. Not many people read books. I'm more intrigued by these experimentations that we've talked about, things that have emerged, like things like, you know, these direct democracy moments, you know, that we were talking about with James Edwards. Like this was a real response to, I think, a real failure of imagination with planning, and it had power in some senses, and it was eventually defeated. But you know, these sorts of movements that do build up these power, they are drawing on people like C.L.R. James. They're drawing on people who write crazy pamphlets for their Trotskyist friends about you know, ancient Athens. There's this sort of complicated relationship between activists and ideas, and I think, you know, as someone who I spend a lot of my time doing activism, being involved in trade union movements. If people know the United Auto Workers, I'm a member as a graduate student. Weirdly enough, many graduate students in the United States are unionized with the auto workers. And I've been able to go to lots of meetings where we've been talking about unionizing the electric car industry, where we have these bizarre Zoom calls where it's a bunch of people in Massachusetts and a bunch of people in Kentucky, you know, these you know, auto workers. And it was amazing being in these meetings because, you know, I wasn't going to say anything bad about electric cars to the automaker makers, but there was a few of them who were like, shouldn't we be making buses? Like, why are we making cars? This doesn't make any sense. And I think these sorts of movements were, I mean, we were able to overthrow the president of the UAW and democratically elected president for the first time ever, and now there's all these strike waves. First time ever, yeah, it's always been delegates. So it's like this, you know, trading process. But, you know, there's, I guess I'm rambling, but the point is that the real movements are what do it, but real movements have this drawing on ideas. And, you know, as someone who participates in these movements, this idea that, you know, there's some resentment of intellectuals by working class people, I just don't believe in it. Like, I think just from my experience with this sort of bizarre organizing, everyone was extremely happy and enthusiastic about the whole process. Everyone got a kick out of it. Everyone thought it was very funny that we were in the same room. And I guess this gives me hope. And then there's also the movements like this sort of link between science and activism. I think there's some possibilities that are emerging, and there's some movements that are emerging in this climate world that are possibly promising. But
I would, I don't know, was it the Socialist Workers' Party or which?
No.
Yeah.
Totally different.
Okay. Socialist Party of Great Britain.
yeah.
Okay, sorry to mix that up.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, because I was asking if I should talk to them, and I think they seem fun.
Okay, not the devs. Okay. I don't know much about their utopian plans, and I'd be interested to read more about them. In my own experience, I found that there aren't that many rigorous, satisfying utopian proposals on the left. Again, it tends to be this like a small Ostromium Commons or some like super technophile, fully automated luxury communism kind of thing, and they don't solve the problem of coordination without markets, and that is the problem in some ways, and that's what we're trying to figure out with our work. And I think and we're trying to approach it as something that can, be solved with trade-offs. And I would say, as an intellectual historian, that ideas matter, and I think a lot of Marxists think that it's just material conditions and that's it, and ideas are useless. And they also tend to underestimate the neoliberals. With the neoliberals, they're very thoughtful, they're very creative, they're well organized, and they take ideas from everywhere, like, again, from the left all the time, and they show the power of ideas. Like, they're a relatively small group of people. Right? I mean, I said like there are so many think tanks and all that, but it's in like the tens of thousands or something like this. But they have been able to change the world because they are the ones who are constantly producing proposals. And so when there's a crisis, as Milton Friedman said, you take the ideas that are at hand. And I think the problem with the left is that we've had crises galore. We've had 2008, 2020, but because we didn't have rigorous, practical ideas, we let these crises go to waste, right? And I think, again, we should be able to beat the neoliberals at their game, right? We have to win the socialist calculation debate. And then I think, hopefully, we can make a coalition of environmentalists, anti-racist activists, animal liberationists, socialists, and that could actually change.